A mother's worst nightmare becomes a chilling reality when her 12-year-old son confesses to something unimaginable. What happens when a child's darkest secret threatens to tear a family apart? Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about guilt, love, and the unthinkable choices we make. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Sarah sat in the living room, the dim light from the TV casting shadows on the walls. Her fingers traced the edge of her coffee mug, the warmth calming her. But something felt off. She could hear her son, Tom, moving around in the kitchen. He was usually chatty, laughing or humming. But tonight, silence filled the space. She frowned, peering into the hallway. "Tom," she called, her voice breaking the stillness. No answer. Her heart thudded harder as she stood up. Something wasn't right. She walked toward the kitchen, each step echoing in the emptiness. The lights in there flickered for a moment, then steadied. Tom was standing at the counter, his back to her. He didn't turn around when she entered. His shoulders were tense. His hands gripped the countertop. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Tom didn't respond. A chill ran through her as she stepped closer. His head slowly turned, but his eyes didn't meet hers. They were fixed on the floor. "Mom," he whispered, his voice shaky. "Yeah, honey," she said, now standing right behind him. Tom lifted his head. His eyes were wide. Fear. "I did something," he said, his words soft but heavy. Sarah's stomach twisted. She crouched down to his level, trying to make sense of his expression. "What do you mean, baby?" she asked. Tom's hands started to tremble. He swallowed hard. "I hurt someone," he said. Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Hurt someone?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind raced, her heart pounded in her chest. Tom nodded, his face pale. He wouldn't look at her now. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to," he mumbled, shaking his head as if trying to push the words back. "What happened, Tom?" Sarah's voice cracked as she gripped his shoulders, her fingers digging into his skin. Tom was quiet for a moment, then he spoke again. "I hurt someone at school today," he said. Sarah's breath caught. Her mind scrambled to understand. "Who, Tom?" she managed to ask. Tom's eyes finally lifted, locking with hers. But what she saw in them made her heart stop. The terror. And then he whispered the name. A name that made her entire body freeze. "I hurt Emily." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Emily?" Sarah repeated, her voice shaking. Tom nodded, his eyes wide with fear. She wouldn't leave me alone," he whispered, his hands trembling. I just wanted her to stop. To go away." Sarah's chest tightened, her breath coming faster. Emily. The little girl from the neighborhood. Sweet, always polite. The one Sarah had seen playing in the yard just days ago, laughing with Tom. She's my friend, right?" Tom's voice was barely audible now, filled with guilt. Sarah's mind raced. The calm smile Emily always wore. The way she'd run up to Tom, chatting about the latest school gossip. The last time Sarah had seen her was just that morning, playing tag with Tom outside. "I didn't mean to hurt her, Mom," Tom said, his voice cracking. "I was so mad," she kept saying things, and The words got stuck in his throat. He squeezed his eyes shut, as though trying to block out what he'd done. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for him. Her fingers grazed his arm, but he flinched away from her touch. "I didn't mean it," he repeated, his face contorted in horror. I lost control." Her mind screamed, but her voice couldn't keep up. "Tom, what did you do to her?" Tom's eyes welled with tears. "I pushed her. I didn't think," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "She fell, and then she hit her head. And she didn't move after that. She didn't wake up." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her legs weakened, her grip on the counter faltering. Tom's words echoed in her head, each one more chilling than the last. She didn't wake up, he said again, his voice barely a breath. The room felt like it was closing in on her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Tom's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm scared, Mom," he whispered. "Where is she, Tom?" Sarah's voice was tight, desperate. Tom froze. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Where did you leave her?" Sarah's voice cracked. Tom's lips parted, but no words came out. The silence stretched, unbearable. Then, Tom whispered the words that shattered everything. "She's in the shed, Mom." The words hit her like a tidal wave. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The shed. Her mind scrambled, replaying the image of that old, rickety shed at the edge of their yard. It had always been a place for forgotten tools, cobwebs, and dust. A place Tom liked to retreat to when he wanted to be alone. "Tom, no." Her voice was barely audible as she took a step back, the air thick around her. "I didn't know what to do," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I thought she would be okay." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. Her legs trembled as she slowly moved toward the door. "Mom, please." "I'm sorry." "Please don't leave me," Tom pleaded, his voice full of panic. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't stop herself. She reached the door and stepped outside into the cold, night air. Her heart raced as her feet carried her toward the shed. The path seemed longer than ever before. The darkness of the yard stretched endlessly, the moon barely visible through the trees. The wind whispered in her ears, carrying the smell of damp earth and old wood. Her mind was numb, but her feet kept moving, one step after another, drawn to the shed. It was only a few yards away now. The small structure stood in the shadows, silent and waiting. She reached the door and stopped. Her breath came in sharp gasps. The handle was cold in her hand as she turned it, the sound of metal scraping against metal ringing out in the quiet night. The door creaked open. Inside, the shed was dark, except for a small sliver of moonlight filtering through a crack in the wooden walls. Sarah stepped in, her heart hammering in her chest. She could barely see, but she could feel it. The presence of something wrong. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and there, in the far corner, she saw the figure. Emily. Her body lay motionless on the floor, her limbs splayed unnaturally. The sight made Sarah's blood run cold. Emily's head was turned at an odd angle, her face pale and lifeless. A chill swept through Sarah as she stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to break free. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. And then, from the doorway behind her, a voice. "Mom, what did I do?" Sarah froze, her hand still over her mouth, her eyes locked on Emily's lifeless form. The voice behind her sent a wave of dread crashing through her. "Mom, what did I do?" It was Tom again. His voice was trembling, filled with raw panic. Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from Emily. The cold stillness in the shed was overwhelming. It felt like the world had stopped, like time itself was holding its breath. She slowly turned around, her legs unsteady beneath her. Tom stood in the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide, and hands shaking at his sides. He looked so small, so lost, as if he couldn't grasp the reality of what had just happened. "Mom, I didn't mean to. I swear," he said, his voice breaking. I was mad. She made fun of me. She kept calling me names, making me feel small, and I got so angry. I didn't think it would go this far." Sarah's heart twisted in her chest as she tried to process his words, but they made no sense. She could barely understand what was happening. Tom's eyes welled with tears. "I didn't want her to." His voice caught in his throat, and his whole body shook. "I didn't mean it, Mom. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to stop. Just stop." He stepped closer, but Sarah didn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the spot. He was so close now, and she could hear his desperate breathing, see the trembling of his hands. Please, Mom. You have to believe me. I didn't know. I didn't know what I was doing. Sarah swallowed, trying to breathe, to understand. But it was too much. Her mind couldn't keep up with the rush of emotions flooding her. Shock, fear, disbelief. Tom stepped forward again, his eyes pleading. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Please don't hate me, Mom. I didn't know what else to do. His words echoed in her mind, but they didn't feel real. None of this felt real. Sarah's gaze flickered back to Emily's body. Her mind couldn't process the truth, couldn't accept it. Tom stepped closer, trembling. I'm scared, Mom. What do we do now? His voice was broken, desperate. Sarah looked at him, her heart heavy with confusion and terror. I don't know, she whispered, barely able to speak. The air was thick with the weight of everything they had just lost. The silence between them stretched out, unbearable and thick. Sarah stood frozen, her mind a blur of confusion, horror, and disbelief. Tom's desperate gaze pierced through her, pleading for something, anything, to make sense of what they were facing. The world around her seemed muffled, distant, like she was hearing it from underwater. Every breath felt labored, as if the air itself was being sucked from her lungs. Tom moved closer, his footsteps tentative, each one echoing in the small space of the shed. His voice, soft and broken, barely reached her. I didn't mean to kill her, Mom, he whispered. I swear. I didn't want this. Sarah's eyes remained locked on Emily, unable to look away. The stillness of the girl's body seemed to mock her, to taunt her with the unthinkable reality of what had just happened. Her chest tightened with each breath she took, her whole body frozen in place. Tom reached out, his trembling hand hovering near her, but Sarah instinctively stepped back, her eyes still fixed on Emily. Mom, please, Tom's voice cracked as he reached out again. What are we going to do? His words brought her back, snapping her from the shock that had gripped her like a vice. She turned her head slowly, meeting Tom's wide, pleading eyes. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped again, the world silent and suspended between them. And then, like a wave crashing over her, the reality of what they were facing slammed into her. Tom, she whispered hoarsely, her throat dry. What happened to Emily? What do we do now? Tom's face crumpled with guilt and fear, tears streaming down his cheeks. I don't know, he sobbed, collapsing to his knees. I don't know what to do, Mom. Sarah's own tears welled up in her eyes. She wanted to hold him, to comfort him, but she couldn't bring herself to take another step toward him. She couldn't move. The weight of everything that had happened, everything they'd lost, had shackled her in place. She felt as though the walls of the shed were closing in on her, the air thick and suffocating. The reality of the situation was too much to bear. Her own son had done this. Sarah's body trembled. She could no longer stand the crushing silence. Tom, she whispered, choking on the words. What have we done? The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Tom's sobs filled the shed, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to comfort him. She felt numb, like a distant observer in her own body, unable to process the scene unfolding before her. Tom's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body racked with guilt, but Sarah couldn't focus on that. Her mind kept replaying his words. I didn't mean to hurt her. But what did it matter now? Emily was gone. The silence in the shed grew oppressive, the weight of their actions pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She could hear the distant sound of the wind rustling the trees outside, the faintest hint of the world going on, oblivious to the horrors unfolding in this small, dark space. Mom, Tom's voice trembled. What do we do now? His words cut through her, and finally, she blinked. Slowly, she turned to face him. His eyes were swollen, pleading for something, any kind of direction. But Sarah didn't have the answers. She opened her mouth to speak, But no words came. She felt like she was drowning, submerged under the weight of the moment, unable to break through the surface. "What are we going to do?" Tom asked again, his voice barely a whisper now. "We can't just leave her here." The panic in his voice snapped Sarah out of her stupor. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the truth had spilled out of his mouth. He was terrified. And so was she. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she wiped the tears from her eyes. She couldn't think clearly. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess of fear, guilt, and a deep, suffocating sense of betrayal. Betrayal of Emily, betrayal of herself, betrayal of everything she thought she understood about her son. She stumbled back towards the door of the shed, her mind spiraling, unable to process the reality of what had just happened. Tom's voice followed her. "Mom, please. Please don't leave me." The desperation in his voice pulled at her heart, but she couldn't face him. Not like this. She stepped outside, the cold night air hitting her face like a slap, grounding her in a reality she didn't want to accept. The darkness of the yard stretched before her, every tree and shadow now seeming unfamiliar, menacing. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But all she could do was stand there, paralyzed, her mind a storm of confusion and horror. Tom stepped out behind her, his footsteps tentative. His presence felt like a weight at her back. "Mom," he whispered again, his voice raw. "What are we going to do?" The question echoed in her mind as her eyes fell on the dark horizon. What could they do? Her hands were trembling as she clenched them at her sides. We need to call someone," she said, her voice shaking. The words felt hollow, meaningless. Who would she even call? The police? How could she explain this? How could she explain him? The coldness of the night seeped into her bones as the weight of their situation pressed down on her. She had never felt so small, so lost. Tom was beside her now, standing too close, his presence a constant reminder of the horrifying reality they were trapped in. "I didn't mean it, Mom," he said again, his voice breaking, his hand reaching for hers. Sarah flinched, her entire body tensing. She couldn't look at him. Not like this. Not with what he'd done. But his words kept ringing in her ears, over and over again. "I didn't mean it." And for the first time, Sarah wondered if it mattered. The wind howled around them, the cold biting at Sarah's skin, but the chill in her bones was nothing compared to the freeze in her heart. She stood there, her body rigid, torn between the need to flee and the desperate pull to protect her son. She couldn't run from this. She couldn't unknow what he had done. Tom stood at her side, his face streaked with tears, his hands still shaking. His desperate eyes were fixed on her, pleading for understanding, for absolution, for something, anything, to make this nightmare stop. "Mom, please, you have to believe me," he repeated, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean it. I never meant to hurt her. I was angry." Sarah's heart ached. She wanted to believe him, she really did. But the weight of Emily's lifeless body in that shed, the image of her little form twisted on the floor, refused to leave her mind. You hurt her, Tom," Sarah whispered, her voice raw, hollow. "She's gone. You can't take that back." His face crumpled as if her words had struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at her, the horror of what he had done settling deeper into his features. "I didn't mean it, Mom. I swear. I didn't mean it." His voice faltered, broken beyond recognition. He reached out to her again, his hands trembling. But Sarah stepped back, the overwhelming sense of dread and confusion tightening around her chest. She couldn't be near him right now. Not when everything had shifted so drastically. Not when he had crossed a line so far beyond her understanding. "Please, what do we do?" Tom's voice cracked, and Sarah could hear the fear of a child who knew he couldn't take back his actions. A child who realized he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The words swirled in Sarah's mind. "What do we do?" The world felt like it was closing in on her. Everything felt too loud, too sharp. The rustle of the wind in the trees, the distant hum of traffic, Tom's sobs. It was all too much. She looked up at the sky, the moon barely visible behind thick clouds, and for a moment, she felt the crushing weight of the silence that followed. "I don't know," she whispered, barely able to hear herself. "I don't know." The night stretched on, oppressive, suffocating. And with each passing second, it felt like they were sinking deeper into something they couldn't escape. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a dog barking echoed in the stillness. It might have been a world away, or it might have been too close. Sarah couldn't tell. She could only feel the darkness surrounding them, the weight of what had happened pressing down on her with every breath she took. Tom's voice broke through again, desperate, shaking. "Mom, we have to tell someone. We can't keep the secret. We have to fix this. We have to make it right." But how could they fix it? How could anyone fix this? The guilt that clawed at Sarah was suffocating, and she couldn't see a way out. Her mind spun as she stood there, her son beside her, both of them caught in a nightmare that neither of them could wake up from. I can't, Tom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." She had no answers. She had nothing. The words she'd just spoken hung in the air, like a final admission of defeat. "I can't, Tom," she repeated, more to herself than to him. The reality of their situation was suffocating, the weight of it pressing on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She turned her eyes back toward the dark outline of the shed. It stood there like a monument to everything that had gone wrong, everything that could never be undone. She could almost hear the echo of Emily's laughter in her mind, the memory of the girl who had once been so full of life, now reduced to a motionless figure in that shed. How could she ever explain this? How could she ever live with herself, knowing that her son, her boy, the one she had raised, had done this? Tom's hand reached for her, shaking and desperate. "Mom, please." But Sarah pulled away, instinctively recoiling. She didn't mean to, but she couldn't help it. His touch felt foreign, like he was someone else, someone she didn't recognize. His tear-streaked face, the pleading in his eyes, everything about him felt wrong. "Why, Tom?" Her voice trembled, cracking under the weight of the question she didn't want to ask, but couldn't stop herself from asking. "Why did you do it?" "I don't know, Mom. I didn't mean to. She just kept saying things. And I got so mad. I couldn't stop. I didn't know what was happening anymore. He stopped himself, the words turning to sobs. He collapsed to his knees on the cold ground, his body racked with guilt. Sarah stood frozen, unable to move, unable to comfort him. She wanted to hold him, to tell him it was going to be okay. But it wasn't going to be okay. She knew that now. A distant siren wailed in the night, the sound piercing the silence. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced, wondering if someone had heard Emily's screams, if someone had seen anything. But she couldn't move. She couldn't face it. "Mom," Tom's voice broke through her thoughts. What if they find out? What do we do then?" The panic in his voice was raw. His entire world had just shattered, and he was asking her to pick up the pieces. But Sarah didn't know how to fix this. She didn't even know where to begin. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The air felt thick, pressing down on her as if the world itself was closing in, trapping them in a place where nothing could ever be the same again. Tom was still on his knees, his body shaking with the force of his sobs, and Sarah stood there, her heart broken, her mind numb. She wanted to tell him it would all be okay, but deep down, she knew better. She had no answers, no solutions, no way to undo what had been done. Her eyes flickered toward the darkened horizon, where the faintest light of dawn was beginning to break through the clouds. A new day was coming, but it didn't matter. Nothing would ever be the same again. Her gaze drifted back to her son, who was still sobbing at her feet, lost in his own guilt and fear. "I didn't mean it, Mom," he whispered again, his voice barely a breath. Sarah closed her eyes, her heart breaking into pieces. She didn't know how to fix this. She didn't know how to fix him. All she knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale light over the yard. The shadows that had swallowed the night began to recede, but they left a cold, lingering presence in the air. Sarah stood motionless, her heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. Her gaze was fixed on Tom, still kneeling in front of her, his face pale, his body racked with sobs. The world around them seemed to carry on, indifferent to the devastation they were drowning in. Tom's voice trembled again, cutting through the silence. "Mom,
I'm sorry.
I never wanted this. I didn't mean it." The words felt hollow. He had said them so many times, but they didn't change anything. Emily was gone, and nothing could bring her back. Sarah's heart ached with the depth of her son's pain, but she could barely feel her own anymore. It was as if she had been hollowed out, a shell of the mother she once was. Her gaze wandered toward the shed. The memory of Emily's lifeless body was seared into her mind, a picture she couldn't escape. The guilt, the shame, it all clung to her like a suffocating fog. She turned her eyes back to Tom, his face streaked with tears, his hands trembling in the cold. She wanted to hold him, to comfort him, but the distance between them seemed insurmountable. He had taken something irreplaceable, and no matter how much she wanted to protect him, the truth was too much to bear. "Mom, please," Tom whispered again, his voice breaking. "What do we do now?" Sarah closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. What could she possibly tell him? What could she say to make this all go away? She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "I don't know, Tom. I don't know what we do." The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, as they both stood there, caught in the aftermath of a tragedy that couldn't be undone. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder, getting closer. Sarah took a deep breath, the reality settling in around her. The world was coming. They couldn't run anymore. But what would they say when it all came to light? Would anyone believe them? Would anyone understand? And would it even matter? The sirens grew louder. They were almost here. There was no escaping this. No hiding. No turning back. Only the quiet, unrelenting truth. The sirens were getting closer, their wail rising and falling in the distance, a reminder that time was running out. Sarah stood frozen, her heart heavy in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity. She could hear the rapid beating of her own heart, a rhythmic drum of dread that drowned out the world around her. Tom was still kneeling before her, his sobs shaking his body, his voice a constant plea for forgiveness. But the reality had settled in, thick and unyielding. No amount of apologies could undo what had been done. No words could bring Emily back. Sarah glanced once more at the horizon, where the light of dawn was beginning to spread across the sky. A new day was breaking, but it felt like the end of everything she knew. She looked at her son, her baby, the boy she had raised, the boy she thought she knew. But now, in this moment, he seemed so far away, so different. "I'm sorry, Mom," Tom whispered again, his voice barely a sound. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, anything that could fix this. But she had no answers. No more words to give. The sound of the sirens was so close now. It was no longer a distant echo, but a relentless reality. They were almost here. Tom turned to her, his eyes wide with fear, his hands trembling. "What do we do? Please tell me what we do." Sarah finally stepped forward, her legs shaky beneath her, and knelt down beside him. Her hands found his, trembling as they closed around his. She looked at him, her eyes filled with pain, but also with something deeper, something that might have been love. "We face it," she whispered. Tom's eyes filled with tears as she gently squeezed his hand. The sirens grew louder, now unmistakably close. Sarah stood up, pulling Tom with her. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, the weight of everything they had lost. It was time to stop running, time to face the truth. The door of the shed loomed behind them, the place where their world had fallen apart. Sarah turned away from it, her gaze focused ahead, toward the inevitable future. She took a deep breath, the first clear one she had taken all night, and walked toward the road. Tom followed her, his steps hesitant but steady. They couldn't undo what had happened, but they could face the consequences. And in that moment, Sarah realized that no matter how much it hurt, she had to hold on to her son, to whatever was left of him. The sirens were right behind them now, and she was ready to face whatever came next.